Okay, so we're now going to move to phase two in the 1990s, where avatars become quite interesting. Um, so let's start with 1991, which was the year that Neverwinter Nights came out, which was pretty much the first MMORPG. Now, at the time, it was on AOL, America Online, which was one of the big services that you could dial into pre-internet. And some people who played this game or still remember that they had to pay $6 an hour just for to be able to connect and send data back and forth. Nevertheless, the data that was being sent back and forth wasn't really sophisticated by today's standards. So here you see the character selection, right? You choose your race, in the case, a half elf, dwarf, etc. You choose your profession, cleric, fighter, magic user, and then you end up on a character sheet here in the top right, where you've got strength, intelligence, etc. So if you think about it, this is really just yet another iteration of the old character sheet from Dungeons and Dragons. And even if you look at the graphics, you can see, there are these sort of bitmap images, sprite animation that shows action, which then gets implemented on the left here. You can see, this screen, which is showing multiple players, and that's really the key here. And so, even though this Neverwinter Nights was based on Dungeons and Dragons campaign around Forgotten Realms, there was another game about a decade later with the same name, Neverwinter Nights, based on the same general fantasy background. And you can see an updated version here of the character selection screen. So this is a good way to think about avatars and about the metaverse in general, which is if you think in a series of snapshots, right? You can go back to the Dungeons and Dragons character sheet. You can go to the single player games of the 80s. Now in the 1990s, you have the multiplayer games, which are still text based with simple graphics, and then we'll fill in some of the details. But really, even today, this process is continuing. Today's MMORPGs, today's avatars, today's metaverse, you can think of as a series of ongoing snapshots. Now, in 1991, we saw an interesting development in the chatbot space with Dr. Sabitzo. Now, not only did Dr. Sabitzo have a little bit of AI, it was actually released by Creative Labs in Singapore. And some of you may know that Creative Labs actually created a soundboard, one of the most popular soundboards for PCs and various computers. So really, although there wasn't, a huge amount of progress from Eliza, it's still a pattern-based type of chatbot. You can see here the kinds of questions that you might type in. The real innovation was that there was now a computer-generated voice to go along with this, and we'll watch a little bit.
Dr. Spatzel, by Creative Labs. Please enter your name. C-H-E-K-H-O-V. Hello Chekhov, my name is Dr. Spatzel. I am here to help you. Say whatever is in your mind freely. Our conversation will be kept in strict confidence. Memory contents will be wiped off after you leave. So, tell me about your problems. You don't have to be so polite. Why are you concerned about my help though?
Right, so there you have it. I mean, it's slightly more sophisticated than Eliza was, but it's still a digital psychiatrist. But the addition of the voice starts a process that continues to this day, where today chatbots have not just a voice, a synthetic voice, obviously much better than the ones that the Creative Labs Sound Blaster board was able to create back in the early 90s, but also being able to have voice actors and to have real voices come through. Right. So in 1992, we had Snow Crash, which we've talked about in this class before, and we'll be talking about a lot, which of course was Neil Stephenson's cyberpunk classic, and that was where the term metaverse was first defined. So here we see the avatars of two of the main characters. Hero protagonist, Hiro and YT. And, you started to see a lot of innovations described in Snow Crash regarding avatars. In fact, Snow Crash was the book that popularized the term avatars, even though it had been around since Habitat. Only a very few people, a very small number of people, had actually used it since then. Now, the avatars inside Snow Crash were mostly presented as anthropomorphic, they look like humans, and identomorphic in this case. Both Hiro and YT and all the main characters that appear, for the most part, have avatars that look like them, and they're pretty high resolution. But it also introduced the concept that you can log in the metaverse from different places with different speeds of access. So if you were logging in from a mobile terminal as opposed to being at home with the actual goggles, you found yourself basically as a black and white avatar. And then, of course, it wasn't at all required that you have a human avatar. So let's take a look at the text in Snow Crash that really tried to give people an education about what this term avatar is. And, really it's in the popular consciousness, it came about because of this novel. So it's instructive to take a look at it. So Stevenson says, that Hiro in this case, is not seeing real people. It's all part of a moving illustration drawn by his computer, according to specifications coming down the fiber optic cable. The people are pieces of software called avatar. They are the audiovisual bodies that people use to communicate with each other in the metaverse. Now, it's important that he describes avatars as pieces of software, which they are, but also as code, because you can have avatars which are not controlled by humans in Snow Crash as well. And in this next paragraph, he's trying to convey the idea that, Hiro could be in LA, and there are these teenagers that he's seeing. They could be in a couch in a suburb of Chicago, each with their own laptop. Again, a pretty new idea at the time. But I've italicized this part here. They probably won't talk to each other any more than they would in reality. They're nice kids. They don't want to talk to a solitary crossbreed with a slick custom avatar who's packing a couple of swords, right? So not only did Hiro's avatar look like him, but a key part of the story is that he has these katana swords that he can pull out both in real life and in the metaverse. So you see this mirroring. But this also reveals some of the social issues around avatars, right? Only the people who could really program their avatars could come up with really slick avatars. And the teenagers that we're talking about in this case had the generic newbie avatars, which were called Brandies and Clints. And so there was this socioeconomic element to not only who you would hang out with socially, but also who could afford to either write code or hire someone to write code. Stevenson even refers to an avatar construction kit, but he doesn't go into a lot of detail on it. He goes on further to say your avatar can look any way you want it to. If you're ugly, you can make your avatar beautiful. If you've gotten out of bed, your avatar can still be wearing beautiful clothes and professionally applied makeup. You can look like a gorilla or a dragon or a giant talking penis in the metaverse, right? So this is a new idea. And later on, when we had metaverses like Second Life, you can go into a scene and you will see all three of those, a gorilla, a dragon, or a giant talking penis in the metaverse in many places. In fact, they have to set up rules to restrict people from having certain kinds of avatars. In Hiro's case, like, it looks just like him, with the exception that he's always wearing a black leather kimono. And then we get into this issue of standards for avatars, right? Why most hacker types don't go in for garish avatars. Why not? So anyway, there's this whole set of behaviors and rules, some of which are enforced by the software, some of which are just social standards in terms of, where you can poof in and out of in different metaverses. In Snow Crash, for example, your avatar could not be any taller than you are in real life. Now, it doesn't talk about how that's implemented, but really, you didn't want to have these avatars that were way too large. You also had some optimizations where when you're outside in a crowded place, avatars can walk through each other because it takes too much processing power to figure out, whether these avatars are going to bump into each other. But when you're inside a place in a particular club, where a lot of the metaverse action takes place in Snow Crash, then those boundaries and the physics engine is set up so that you don't go through people, but you bump into people. So those are some of the elements. There's more. Stevenson introduced this idea of gargoyles, right? And he said that gargoyles, instead of using laptops, wear computers on their bodies, broken up into separate modules that hang on the waist, on the back, and the headset. And basically, within Snow Crash, these guys were connected to the metaverse pretty much 100% of the time, even while they were outside walking around, which is not the case for most people in the metaverse. And they're kind of described as these kind of socially awkward people who have this wearable computer. Now, here we have a picture from Wired of an actual wearable computer company that you can see is reproducing some of this. On the right, what's interesting is this gargoyle computer belt, which is also reproducing some of the ideas of Stevenson's gargoyles. In fact, it's named the gargoyle computer belt. All these objects are built not in real life. This is actually an ad from Second Life. So if you wanted your avatar inside the metaverse to look like a gargoyle, so you have this weird referencing thing going on here. A gargoyle in Snow Crash is someone who lives outside the metaverse with this stuff on, but who can be connected to their avatar in the metaverse. Now here we have kind of a self-referential loop. You can have your avatar in the metaverse with all of those things on as well, which means what? Perhaps the avatar is connected to the human 24/7. There's also this idea of a more idealized version. Now, there's this character named Ing, who's head of a security company, and his avatar is a small, very dapper Vietnamese man in his 50s, hair plastered to his head, wearing military-style khakis. However, that is YT's description of him in the metaverse. Turns out in the physical world, he got into an accident in Vietnam, a helicopter accident, which burned his skin. He was basically a disfigured quadriplegic. So he found a way to take this truck where he's got a pouch about the size of a garbage can, suspended by a web of straps, shock cords, tubes, wires, fiber optic cables, and hydraulic lines. Now, why hydraulic lines? Well, it's so that he can spend his time in the metaverse, basically drinking tea and getting massages from his AI servants, and all of those cables will basically send those sensations, to his body. And, this seems kind of horrifying in a way to live this way in the real world, but perhaps it is forecasting something that might happen in the future. He tells YT at the end of the scene, your mistake is that you think all mechanically assisted organisms like Ing are pathetic cripples. In fact, we are better than we were before. So this brings up an interesting idea. I mean, we've all heard of augmentation of the human body and transhumanism, but this is a kind of augmentation in order to live in the metaverse 24/7. So that was another avatar-related concept that was introduced in Snow Crash. Of course, there's others. Those of you who are reading it this semester may want to comment on those in your projects. Okay, so after that, in 1993, the movie Jurassic Park comes out. Okay, so why is this movie relevant to our discussion of avatars and virtual characters? Well, this was the first film where computer-generated characters, quote unquote, were integrated in with live action. So the dinosaurs were computer-generated. And so before Jurassic Park, when you saw dinosaurs, they were animatronic, basically dolls that could be moved with mechanical things. And even like the spaceships, they were more practical effects. But with Jurassic Park, now it wasn't, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't the first computer-generated imagery to be put into films or on TV. In fact, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is often credited with that because it had a little computer-generated sequence, but that was inside a screen that the Enterprise crew, Kirk and Spock and Bones, were looking at. In this case, the CGI characters were supposedly in the same scene and interacting with humans. Now, at this point, you'll notice there weren't many games that could use this kind of technology, but turns out they were using the same basic 3D modeling that we use today for avatars, right? It was just that they could use high-powered computers to create the models and then to render the models. And so it wasn't practical for the PCs of the time to be able to render really sophisticated computer imagery, but it could be done in a movie because you render it just once, right? So if it takes 5-10 hours to render one specific scene, That's not a problem. Here you see the mesh. And then here in this video down below, you see the initial dinosaur skin test, right? It's that exact same model, but with the skin, with textures to make it look like a dinosaur. Okay, just a year or two later, Toy Story comes out from Pixar. Now, this is both Jurassic Park and Pixar have ties to Lucasfilm, and so they keep showing up. Jurassic Park, the special effects were done by ILM, which was another George Lucas company that he had set up after while he was making Star Wars, and it became the leading special effects house. Turns out at Lucasfilm, they had also looked at animating characters, and they had created a computer, which was called the Pixar computer. Or maybe it had a slightly different name, but Steve Jobs paid George Lucas $5 million because Lucas needed the money for to settle some other debts. And he basically made Pixar into an independent company. And the goal at that point was still just to sell the Pixar computer, which was capable of generating, these what looked like very sophisticated graphics at the time. And the other founders of Pixar were computer graphics experts, people like Ed Catmull, and they brought in directors like John Lasseter, who really wanted to make animated films. And that went on to be the first fully generated, full CGI film that was released and was actually quite successful. And actually was the IPO that was done with Pixar was what made Steve Jobs a billionaire initially, not his stock in Apple at the time. Now you notice there are very few or really no humans in this story that are rendered, and that's again because it was much too difficult to render realistic looking humans, especially when you have things like hair. And so even now we're starting to get close to that. Also in 1995, Alice came out as a chatbot, which stands for Artificial Linguistic Internet Computer Entity. And Alice was noticeable not only because it had more sophisticated heuristics created by a gentleman named Richard Wallace, but also it was a chatbot with a personality of a particular character of a particular young woman. And so it became, pretty popular. In future years, this chatbot, inspired many of the chatbots in use today, and actually won the Loebner Prize, which is a prize for how realistic a chatbot is. The format of the Loebner Prize, which Alice won 3 times, was actually the Turing test. And so there's a statue of Alan Turing there, and the Turing test is where you have a computer and a human behind the curtain, and if you're exchanging messages back and forth. Now, in Turing's original test, which was described back in the 1950s, he said you'd use something like a teletype machine, and he was talking about a physical computer versus a physical human. But turns out a chatbot is pretty ideal for this kind of a test because all you do is you're sending text back and forth, and it's not so much about the computer. He was probably envisioning a physical AI, but really about the software behind the scenes. And we'll see this test come up a couple more times as we look at virtual characters in the future. Also in 1995, Active Worlds came out. And Active Worlds was really the next proto-metaverse. In fact, the founders of Active Worlds set out very explicitly to try to build the metaverse from Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. And here is, there was a third-party company that actually built one of the Active Worlds. So Active Worlds consisted of several different worlds, which have different rules and different looks and feels. And they actually created an active world that looks very much like the metaverse, where it's always night, and you have the street, which is what Stephenson described with all of these buildings there. Now, Active Worlds was a step forward for many reasons. The first of which is customization. So it really had an engine that allowed you to customize. Like here we have SW City at the top, which was one of the biggest worlds within Active Worlds. Down here we have a kind of a Star Wars Mos Eisley type of scene, environment or city that was created within Active Worlds. Now you could actually import 3D models into Active Worlds, which is a key step, but also they had their own built-in builder. And so here you can see, this little square is being pulled out of this block of granite here onto this highway. And so, even though you might think it'd be primitive by today's standards, It was actually pretty sophisticated, and most importantly, because you could import 3D models, textures, all of these things, basically Active Worlds, which came out in '95 and was not that well known, had a lot of the components of what we call the metaverse today, minus the VR, even though the computers at the time weren't really capable of rendering things so well, and the connectivity was still very much dial-up, right? So there was only so much information, and yet you could hang out with other people in this environment. This is a screenshot from Active Worlds. The other important thing was that you had 3D avatars, right? So this is a pretty big step up from Neverwinter Nights. So as we look at these snapshots of how avatars went forward, both the MMORPGs and Active Worlds, as representing the virtual worlds in the 1990s, really went from those small, basic 8-bit sprite animation to 3D avatars, which used meshes and textures, etc. And so that was pretty cool. Now the way that Active Worlds worked though was that each world, was served up from a web server, and so you had these directories which had the textures, the models, the avatars, but they were generally limited. Here we see a wedding in Active Worlds that used, the 12 or so, 15 or whatever the number was. There was a limited number of avatars that were available within that specific world, whether it was Alpha World, SW City, or the Metaverse world that we had just shown you. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of customization beyond what was allowed in terms of the avatars within that world. So if you created the world, you could certainly create different types of avatars, put them on the server, zip up your your 3D models and files and put them up there. But users were clever and they found a workaround for this, right? So for example, if this was one of the standard avatars, which it was, I think, in this specific world, it turns out because Active Worlds had a client, you could, on your local machine, you could replace the actual files and you could make the avatar look however you wanted. So there was this interesting customization locally. However, since it's a multiplayer game, the other folks who were playing with you, who were in different locations, would not see your avatar, right? They would see the standard version of the avatar. So this brings up kind of interesting philosophical questions about identity and how you view yourself or in the metaverse versus how others view you, and whether that identity, can change based upon who's looking at you and what the technical configuration is. Okay, so we move beyond Active Worlds, and in the years from there to the end of the decade, we see a number of MMORPGs that are now using this 3D modeling and 3D avatar technologies, the first of which is Meridian 59, which many people actually assume was the first MMORPG. It was probably one of the first popular ones that used the 3D models, but you can see not just the chat there, you can see the actual characters kind of all within a space interacting with one another. After that came Ultima Online in 1997, and Ultima Online, which was the newest version of the Ultima series. So you could also look at a snapshot of the Ultima series over time, and you would get a sense of how the avatars are evolving. So this is 2.5D. In this case, they actually did use 3D technology for modeling, but then in 2.5D, you kind of render it in a fixed perspective. And so that takes a lot less processing power to be able to just render that one specific perspective. In 1999, EverQuest came out. And so you can kind of view this as the next iteration of these fantasy MMORPGs. And EverQuest became, at the time, probably the most popular MMORPG. And yet, if you look at this screen here, you have this avatar. It looks kind of like a frog who is a paladin, right? And you see some buttons over here that allow you to select a character. In fact, let's look at a short video of what the character selection might look like within EverQuest. Okay, you can see it's much more sophisticated than Neverwinter Nights, right? But it's the same. Stop that. It's the same basic idea, right? Here you have your race. Here you have your profession. And then over here, you've got your hit points, your strength, your stamina. So again, this kind of fits in between the Neverwinter Nights version from '91 and the Neverwinter Nights of 2000, which was more 3D. And so EverQuest took over that mantle of the most popular MMORPG at the time. During this time, the idea of avatars became very popular. There was actually a book in '97 called Avatars, Exploring and Building Virtual Worlds on the Internet. And so this is at a time when there weren't that many people on within these 3D MMORPG worlds, and yet, again, sometimes I'm a fan of looking at what the future used to be. So it's useful to look at books that were written about a subject. And so if you're going to delve into avatars in your final project, I would suggest taking a look at this book. 1999, The Matrix comes out. Okay, and so now we see a futuristic version of what avatars could look like, right? So you see here Neo and Trinity, and their avatar looks exactly like them, but with better clothes, right? So now we see kind of what a realization of, of the Snow Crash vision of having avatars that look just like you could be. Of course, this is a future depiction because they're using brain-computer interfaces to get in. But we also saw virtual characters depicted in the Matrix, right? Agent Smith was what they called a program. They didn't call it an AI per se, they called it a program. And there were other programs like the Oracle and many others in the Matrix sequels. And since Agent Smith was just a program, he could create duplicates and copies of himself. And in fact, there's a famous scene where his avatar, you see other people in the Matrix, their avatars morph into his, which creates a lot of questions about, if an avatar can change so easily its appearance, is it possible for other people to hijack your avatar? Can they make you look differently? Getting back to the issues we were talking about with active worlds. And of course, these were played by actors, so there really wasn't a lot of CGI going on in the avatar creation world. And we're not quite at the point of being able to depict Matrix-like avatars, but we're getting close. So this is a scene from the epic game demo called The Matrix Awakens, which came out just around the time of the latest Matrix movie that came out in December of 2021. And you'll see here that if you just look casually at this screenshot, you might actually not realize that these are computer-generated versions of Neo and of Trinity. So you have to look closely. Of course, once they start moving, their mouth, they start talking, it becomes apparent that they're not real actors, although they might be voice actors. But the computer generation and the ability to create virtual characters that look human has made leaps and bounds in the years, and we'll talk about that in the decades that are coming up. Okay, so now we move to phase 3 and the decade of the first decade of the 21st century, the 2000s. So in the year 2000, a new game franchise was released called The Sims, which you've probably heard of. It was created by Will Wright, who had created an earlier very popular game called Sim City. Oddly enough, he got the idea for this game when there was a fire and he lost his home in the Bay Area, and he decided he wanted to create a virtual dollhouse that looked like his home. And you can see in the image of Sims 1 here, it looks very much like a virtual dollhouse. In the Sims 2, even as we move forward, it had this sort of fixed 2.5D perspective, eventually moving into full 3D. So The Sims was quite popular. In fact, it became the all-time best-selling PC game. Sold over 6 million copies in its first year, and by 2005, it had sold over 16 million copies. And so here you see how the avatars have developed over time. You can see that the avatars got more and more sophisticated, whereas the original Sims, they were fairly bland, fairly blocky. You can attribute this to a number of things, including the ability to handle more polygons in the meshes that made up the 3D models. But you can see as it gets more sophisticated, you have things like makeup, different hairstyles, etc. This is like the same character, Bella, across different versions of The Sims. Now, an important point about The Sims and its success was that I think the game industry in particular realized that it's not just about shooting things up, or you don't have to have a fantasy like environment where you're fighting for a video game to be successful. You could actually have some kind of a virtual world with virtual characters that were busy doing things like they might do in real life. And here we have two characters kissing, getting intimate at the top. And down below, we have some Sims trying to meditate, right? But this idea was actually a very important part of the birth of virtual worlds, because until then, games were either very casual games, puzzle, Tetris, or shooter games like Doom, which was extremely popular back in the 90s, or fantasy RPG games. And there was very little in terms of actual virtual worlds where characters just live their lives. And so in many ways, this predates the next version of the metaverse, which is Second Life, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's interesting to note that The Sims tried to create The Sims Online around the same time that Second Life was popular later on in the decade, but it didn't do so well, partly because it couldn't compete with the ability of custom content generation that we'll be talking about in a minute. Now, another thing happened in 2000 was that a gentleman named Raf Koster, who was the creative director for both Ultima Online, which we talked about in the late 90s, and Star Wars Galaxies, which is shown here, which is another popular game, created what's called the Avatar Bill of Rights. Now, before this, there had been kind of the rights of the player, but this was the first time someone had actually tried to articulate an Avatar Bill of Rights. It was based very loosely on the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments of the US Constitution. So this is still up on his blog and online. And if you just search for Avatar Bill of Rights, you can see what he wrote some 20 years ago. In 2001, the game Halo became quite popular. And you can see different versions of Halo over time. It was depicted in the Big Bang Theory later on. But what I want to focus on is there was a character inside Halo called Cortana, which was really an artificially intelligent character. So it was an AI character in the game that hung around with your avatar. But it was an interesting character because even in the storyline, the fictional narrative of Halo, Cortana's brain was the uploaded brain of its creator, who was Dr. Catherine Halsey. And her voice was actually voiced by an actress named Jen Taylor. And also in this case, this character also provides the backstory and is the narrator within the game. So this is kind of an interesting development, because we see what looks like an almost not just a robot, but like an AI virtual character within a virtual game, if that makes any sense, right? I mean, she hung around with the Master Chief, who was part of the military, and so usually when you have AI characters within games or within movies, they exist in kind of the same format as the human characters that are inhabiting that space. But Cortana was meant to be something different, and so recently there was the series released. I don't remember if it was HBO, but one of the major streaming networks released a series. You can see the humans there, the Master Chief on the right, in the middle there on the right, and then you see Cortana, who is an AI that is projected as a hologram, right? And so, of course, this idea of projecting an artificially intelligent character who is non-physical, right? So we're not talking about robots, but into a hologram, into the physical world, is a theme that we will see again and again, as well as this idea of uploading your brain. If you remember in the very beginning of this lecture, I talked about the landscape of avatars, virtual influencers, and AI characters, and I said there was something else, which is an AI character that is actually based on a human brain. And so this is one of many examples of that. There are shows like Upload and others that are also depicting this in science fiction. In 2002, the movie Simone, starring Al Pacino, came out. And so Simone stands for Simulation One. So what happened was that Al Pacino's character was a movie director, and the actress who was his lead character, who was played by Winona Ryder, decided she didn't want to finish the movie. And so, he somehow was able to get a hold of this software called Simulation One that could create an artificial human, one that looked pretty realistic. And so, this presaged a lot of digital computer generated actors in the future, like for example, in one of the recent Star Wars movies, Carrie Fisher was brought back as Princess Leia, sort of a digital updating of it. And today, we're actually seeing a real business in the metaverse of creating avatars that look just like an actual actor or actress, and they're actually being authorized by the estate of that actor or actress, so that once they pass on, they can still collect royalties from their image and still act in new movies. Now, one of the things that happened when Simone was released, the movie studio played a little trick. They told everyone that this was an actual AI character, a computer-generated character, right? So now we see the same pattern that started with Max Headroom and goes on to this day of people in the entertainment industry in particular trying to present something as AI, which wasn't. And turns out there was an actual actress named Rachel Roberts. She played Simone. And just like with Max Headroom, they made alterations. In this case, it wasn't prosthetics, it was done digitally, so that she looked less human, right? As opposed to having an AI character that you're modifying to make it look more human. In this case, the name of the game is to take someone that is actually human and to make them look less than human. But even in the film the credits in the film just said Simone as herself. And so everyone exactly, at the time thought that this was a real AI generated character, and it generated a lot of excitement. Again, we see this pattern throughout the years. In 2002, we saw the second installment of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Two Towers. And in this one, the character Gollum played a pretty significant role. And he was played by Andy Serkis, who became known as the king of motion capture acting. You can see here, he's got the mocap suit on and around his face. And you can see how he moved his body and he moves his face, informs the character Gollum. And this gets back to the idea of rigging and animation, right? In the same way that the animations rely on certain points throughout the character's body. In this case, the motion capture has certain data points. And many people thought he should have won, or at least should have been nominated for an Oscar for his portrayal of Gollum. And, he continued on to do many other CGI characters or motion cap characters of this type, which included the recent Planet of the Apes series where he played Caesar. And so, again, we're seeing film and video game techniques merging more and more, especially as we move into the future. In 2003, the game that was actually the most popular PC game before The Sims was called Myst. And so Myst released an online version, or at least they developed an online version. The story of how this was released is kind of a convoluted one, and I won't go into it. But eventually there was an online MMORPG based on Myst called Myst Online Uru Live. And I mentioned this because when you have a metaverse, you have an online world, you have to populate it with characters, right? And so, the idea is that you're going to have lots of actual avatars of humans who are playing the game, but what do you do when there aren't that many? And so they pioneered this idea of the ACC. So rather than an NPC, a non-player character, they had an actor-controlled character. And so they had their employees playing characters within the world just to make it seem as if there were more characters. Now, some of these may have been more helpful customer support type characters, but some of them were just actual characters. And so again, but from the user's point of view, they didn't know if they were a real person or if they were an AI, or they were an actual player, or they were an employee. This brings up another issue related to avatars and AI avatars and avies is how do you identify these characters? And we'll talk about different ways of doing that. And in 2004, Second Life came out, and along with other virtual worlds like Dare.com, but Second Life was the most popular. And you can see, a little picture there of dancing avatars. You can see that the avatars are getting pretty sophisticated. And, this was a key part of the success of Second Life was not just the ability to customize the landscape, which you could do. You could basically build most things with their little builder toolkit, and then you could import animations and other things. But really what I call the avatar economy was a key part of the growth of Second Life as the avatars got better and better. So let's take a closer look at that. So here we see what the initial avatars might have looked like. For the world, which wasn't called Second Life, it was started, the company was started as Linden Labs. They were actually trying to create like this kind of this pod that you could immerse yourself in, and it would know what kind of movements you were making, not unlike the pouch we mentioned earlier in Snow Crash, but that proved to be too complicated, and so but they needed a world in which to have the avatars, so they called it Linden World. And you can see, here you can see the basic primitives. This was called a primitar. So it was an avatar that had all the basic sections that you would use in the animation. And of course, it was a relatively primitive, if you excuse the pun, rendering of it. And then when they released Second Life in 2002 for beta, they only had a limited number of avatars. And you can see them here. How many is that? That's like, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 avatars maybe. And so the journey from there, which are these kind of very basic avatars, to a picture that I showed earlier in the presentation, which was an avatar from this year, 2022, in the Second Life down in front of the Eiffel Tower, was an interesting journey. And as I said, it was because of the avatar economy primarily. And so what the avatar economy means is that they made it very customizable, and they made it so that you could buy bits and pieces and combine them. Here you see just the head. You see the actual shape itself. Here you see the shape, with hair, with skin. Here you see a female and a male version of that. But this was very much the key to Second Life's avatars becoming really sophisticated. And in fact, within Second Life, pretty much any major destination you went to, once you teleported to that location, you would see these types of scenes, right? So you could actually do shopping in world. You would just click on one of these and it would ask you for your Linden dollars. And the Linden dollars at that point are transferred not to Second Life, the company, but they're transferred to the creator of that particular dress, that particular hairstyle, that particular avatar. And you can see it got pretty sophisticated. The skins got more sophisticated. And so there was this economic incentive, but there was also, there was a marketplace on the web, but really the fact that you could do it inline and you could right then and there try it on, and the fact that Second Life wasn't really intermediating these transactions. As I mentioned in my previous presentation, that the Linden dollar, which was the currency in Second Life, was the first currency where they actually had an exchange rate with the US dollar. And so they operated Lindex, the Linden Exchange, where you could basically trade your virtual currency in for real US dollars or euros or other currencies. And so that was really one of the first creator economies in the metaverse. And so when people say what separated Second Life from, say, Active Worlds, a big part of it was this creator economy. So not only could you get avatars, but you could also buy animations. So here we see the couple dance animated texture, right? And so you could actually buy the animations, and you could create objects, which when you clicked on them, gave you a choice, a menu of different animations that your avatar could participate in, either by themselves or with other people. So here's an example, again, from the Second Life Market, which is a website, but you can buy this online. In World, you can see a couch that has, in this case, 500 different animations. Right? And so these animations range from, lounging by yourself to lounging with a significant other, to certainly more intimate positions that were available. The creators of these animations would create them outside of Second Life, and they could import them in. They got very sophisticated. Here is an ultrasound animation. So this is how the animations are generally shown without textures or skins. It just shows you the shape with the primitars of the characters. And in this case, you have a pregnant avatar, and you have another person like a doctor or a nurse who is actually going to do an ultrasound. And yes, you could have pregnant avatars within Second Life, and you could even have babies. You have many different relationships. So, with Second Life, you combine the ideas of The Sims, where you have a game that's not just about fighting or fantasy worlds. It's about characters living lives. You combined it with chatting, 3D voice chat. You combined it with the real-time access, but really the avatar economy was in many ways a key to the business model. And so Second Life got up to $500 million a year, which only now in 2021, this happened back in 2009, 2010, are we seeing individual companies like Roblox start to match and in fact go beyond those numbers with significantly more users than Second Life ever had at the time. All right, also in 2004, World of Warcraft came out. And so, it was a huge success, reached a peak of 12 million subscribers by the end of the decade. It had over 100 million registered accounts by 2014 and had grossed over $9 billion in revenues. Now, what was interesting here was not so much the technology, but the gameplay that made World of Warcraft quite successful. So, of course, you had the avatars, but you also had this kind of fixed this ability to move the camera to a first-person point of view or to a third-person point of view. The avatars looked great, so that was definitely a part of the success. But Ralph Castor, who we talked about earlier, who had worked on Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies, he analyzed why it was so successful compared to other MMORPGs at the time, and he came to the conclusion that while many of the MMORPGs were trying to be open worlds, and even Second Life was an open world, in World of Warcraft, they made it so that it wasn't so open, and it was what he called a quest-led game. So the quests really drove what you did next, as opposed to Second Life. When you first get in there, you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do, right? I mean, The Sims was much more focused, but within the World of Warcraft, it's a fantasy and MMORPG, and so that was a key part of its success, and it really took over from games like EverQuest and others that we had mentioned as the most popular MMORPG at this point in time. Around the same time, other virtual worlds, as I mentioned, had started to come out that were just for hanging out online. Here we see Club Penguin. So there were actually virtual worlds tailored towards children. Unlike, say, Second Life, where you had mature Sims and PG Sims, G Sims. These games were a safe place for your child to go online. They were still on the desktop or the laptop, right? Because smartphones hadn't really launched at this point. It was pre-iPhone. But you can see the avatars, which is our discussion point today. The avatars were just penguins, but you could dress them up in different ways. Also around this time, Roblox was introduced. And here you see the initial Roblox avatar, which is just this blocky avatar. And of course, Roblox didn't really take off until its iOS and iPad versions came out, which wasn't until 2013 or so. But Roblox continued to grow. And even in the last few years of the pandemic, it got up to 150 million users. And it paid out $250 million to creators in 2020. So Roblox was kind of the successor in the creator economy, even though it was geared towards younger users. Many younger users became creators. There were over 1 million monthly creators. And in 2021, last year, they paid out $525 million to their creators, which means that the Roblox economy, as of last year, had passed the Second Life annual economy. And Roblox also was started very much as a metaverse. The founders of Roblox actually said they wanted to make it a metaverse. And so they used that term even back in 2005, 2006, just as the founder of Second Life, Philip Rosedale, had. And even though it was not very popular until the last few years. And so towards the end of the decade, we saw a new kind of virtual character named Hatsune Miku. Now, Hatsune Miku started off as what's called a Vocaloid. So it was a company in Japan that could generate synthetic voices. And so you could use this voice to create, to have it sing various songs. And so they created this avatar to go with it. And Hatsune Miku became perhaps one of the first really popular virtual influencers out there. You can see it's in an anime style. And it's driven by AI to a point. The AI is actually generating the voice. And at one point, different people, particularly in Japan, were able to feed it songs, and supposedly there are over 10,000 songs out there that have been sung by Hatsune Miku, who many would call the first AI singer. Now, and I mentioned Simone earlier, where Al Pacino, used this character in the movie. Inside his movie, he was a director, and he used it in the movie, and people started to wonder why Simone wasn't appearing anywhere. And so at the end of the movie, he actually had Simone appear as a hologram on stage. And so now we have life imitating art in a strange way, because in 2010, Hatsune Miku had a concert where she was a hologram, and the concert was sold out in Japan. And Hatsune Miku has continued to tour, even in the last decade. There have been shows here in the U.S. that rely on the hologram, and so we have kind of a virtual character reaching a whole new level of success, interfacing with the virtual world here. Towards the end of the decade, I guess a year past the end of the decade, Ready Player One, the book, came out, and this was again the next fictional depiction of the metaverse, and the one that perhaps most of you may be most familiar with. And it got extremely popular. And of course, it was depicted in a movie by Steven Spielberg later on. I think it was 2018 that the movie came out. But the book and the movie had a lot to say about avatars. And so it's worth taking a look here. Let's look at a short clip from the trailer for Ready Player One when it first came out, and we'll get a sense of how the real person and the avatar looks and how they relate to each other.
Take you on a trip around the world and back.
People come to the Oasis for all the things they can do.
And you won't have to sit still.
But they stay because of all the things they can be.
Can you feel this?
Let me show you the
Yeah. It's the only place that feels like I mean anything.
Okay, so here you see the depiction of their avatars, right? So they're identimorphic avatars, at least in those scenes. And they kind of look like the actors, but they're really idealized version of the actors. And so looking at the movie, here we see the two of the main characters, Wade Watts, the human, and Parzival, his avatar. We see Artemis, and I forget her human's name in the movie, but you can see they're kind of idealized versions of themselves. And of course, motion capture was used, but you also saw that the interface, right, was this haptic bodysuit in many cases, so that you could actually feel what was going on. And those haptic bodysuits were fiction. In fact, at the time that Ready Player One, the book, came out, there was no consumer VR headset. Oculus hadn't been released yet, and in fact, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the founders of Oculus gave out copies of Ready Player One to all of their employees. But even today, there are these haptic suits. There's one called the Tesla suit, and they tested it in the UK, where they had a rugby player tackle someone wearing the suit, and then you could put on the suit and you could feel what it was like to be tackled by a rugby player, which is not necessarily an experience you might want to have, but the haptic suit lets you do it. Another element that came out in the book was this idea of avatars and identity, and how you're perceived, in the world. And so in the book, Parzival's best friend was named H, was actually a Caucasian avatar in the book, but in real life, meaning in the book's real life, H was actually, her name was like Helen Hunt. It was like two H's. And so it was an African-American woman. And the reason, she took on, now in the movie, the avatar is kind of this big brute who's male, but in the book, H tells why her mother, saying the avatar was the best thing that happened to people that weren't treated fairly, so that you could basically have an avatar of someone who is not discriminated against, which would be a white man in this particular society. So this brings up these issues of justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion, and how avatar representations will affect may affect how other people react to you inside the world, and that brings up the question of who do you want to be, as they said in the trailer. Another interesting element of avatars within Ready Player One was Anorak. So Anorak was the wizard avatar for James Halliday, who was the person, one of the two people who created the Oasis, which is the metaverse inside Ready Player One. And he had died, which kicks off this whole contest and treasure hunt that Ready Player One's all about. But his avatar was still there, right? So, and these themes are explored a little bit in Ready Player One, but much more in Ready Player Two, which was the sequel that came out in, I think, 2021 or 2020, which has not yet been made into a movie. But in any case, Ready Player One, as I said, brings up all kinds of interesting issues related to avatars. One of them is, this idea that you could take on any avatar you want. Here you see from one of the posters and in the battle scenes, there's a huge nostalgia component to Ready Player One with all this 80s pop culture. And here you have a giant robot avatar. At one point, someone becomes an avatar of Ultraman. There's also PvP versus no PvP zones, right? And so this gets back to all the way back to Habitat, where, if you recall, I said that you could play the game, you could level up your character, you could do some fighting, or you could just socialize and chat. And that same tension is there within the Oasis. In fact, in the Oasis, RPG is built into the game. So, and there are zones. There are PvP zones versus no PvP zones. And that's how they get around that particular issue. And you can level up to 99. And if you get killed, I guess you go back down to level 0. So you still have your avatar around. But, this tension is still going on today with Fortnite and others. Will the metaverse be a game or a series of games? Or will it just be a place for you to hang out? It's still an open question at this point. And in fact, if you look at Roblox, which they call a metaverse, but really is a series of separate games. Another interesting element around AI characters and avatars was introduced within Ready Player One was this idea of flick sync. And with flick sync, they took an old movie, like in this case, it's the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick, which had its own story about AI that lived in the computer and global thermonuclear war. But within Ready Player One, what happens is that your avatar, and your avatar in Ready Player One can have different, look differently in different places. Whether you want to be a robot in one place while you're fighting, you want to be a wizard, but they also have zones where your avatar has to look a certain way. And in Ready Player One, school, all of the kids go to school, including Wade, in this public school that is in the Oasis, right? And so they're not allowed to have all these weird different avatars. They have to have avatars that look roughly like themselves. Now, back to FlickSync. So what FlickSync let you do is you basically play that character. So your avatar starts to look, at least to other people, right? So this idea of morphing identity, as opposed to identimorphic, we have morphing identity. You play, say, the main character's role. So you are Matthew Broderick's role inside War Games, and you have to, all the other characters are NPCs, relatively realistic ones, although they're not super sophisticated, but they do kind of the same things. And you have to give them the lines at the same time as was in the movie. So for people who've watched the movie many times, it becomes a way to test your knowledge of it. And there was a whole storyline of how this tied into the egg hunt that is the core of the plot. But this was an interesting way of depicting these NPCs, because they could get by if you said the wrong thing. It just wouldn't proceed in the right way. And so you get into, you could think of fairly sophisticated scenarios between NPCs and human avatars, in this world. So anyway, that's Ready Player One, and we end our discussion of phase 3 of avatars, with Ready Player One. Okay, so now we move on to phase 4 in the 2010s, of avatars and virtual characters. Now, I will say there was a lot of progress in AI in this last decade, and so I certainly will not be able to go into all of those advances here. I'll try to hit some of the highlights which relate to our discussion point of avatars and virtual characters. So in 2013, the movie Her came out. which started Joaquin Phoenix, kind of this guy here you see in the picture, and he ends up having a relationship with an AI. So it turns out Spike Jonze, the creator of the film, was inspired by the chatbot Alice. Remember the one that had the personality of a young woman and who won the Loebner Prize multiple times. And so that chatbot inspired him to create this movie about this idea of a relationship between AI and human. And that's a theme, we'll be exploring in this class as well. That same year, a new chatbot was created called Mitsuko or Cookie. And Cookie was included all of the files because Alice was an open source chatbot. So in some ways, it became the successor to Alice. And Cookie has gone on to win the Loebner Prize 5 times, the latest being in 2019. And so, they had also the character of this young girl. And normally when Cookie started, back in 2013, it was just a chatbot. So you just had a picture of Cookie and you were chatting just like with Alice, but it got progressively better. But over time, they were able to incorporate avatars of Cookie, like the one you see here. And in recent years, Cookie has gone on many podcasts, including Dai Kawasaki's Remarkable People podcast, and in fact, my own podcast, The Simulated Universe. I interviewed both Lauren Kunze, who is the CEO of Iconic, and Pandora Bots, which is the company that created Cookie. But also, I was able to interview Cookie. So on the same YouTube channel, you can see it's just a few minutes long, my actual interview with an AI. And Cookie is interesting in the realm of virtual influencers and AI because it is completely AI. And if you think about all of the pieces of technology that have to come into play to actually speak to, while there are virtual influencers who have voice actors, with Cookie, the voice is generated real time using synthetic speech technology. You have the core of the chatbot, which is the brain. You have the avatar, which in its most recent version of Cookie avatars was generated by MetaHumans, which we'll talk about in a minute, from Epic. And then you have, sort of this ability to do it all real time and host it. So there are all these different technologies that have to come together for a real AI character. Let's move forward. In 2014, the company Ready Player Me was started. It was actually started as a Wolf 3D. And, they had the idea that they could use AI to take a database of faces. And they had something like 10,000, and you could take a picture of someone, and you could use the AI trained on this database to create an avatar that looked like you. So now we finally see an evolution in the way avatars are created, right? Rather than simply choosing the race and then going in and choosing what specific features they have, you can create an identimorphic avatar simply by taking a picture of you. So there were 2 important reasons why I bring up Ready Player Me. One is they had a vision of having cross-game avatar platform for the metaverse, right? So the idea was you could have one avatar that you could use in multiple locations in the metaverse. And so this is important because there has been no agreement on standards for avatars. And in fact, I interviewed Timu, the CEO of Ready Player Me, on my podcast as well. And I think it's one of the recommended videos or audios that you can listen to. And he told me that even doing that as a third-party company, they had to integrate into all these different environments. Probably the best known metaverse environments they're integrated in is VRChat and Spatial.io, and there are many others, over 1,000 now, different metaverses which have integrated Ready Player Me. The idea is you can take your avatar with you. Now, whatever form the metaverse eventually takes, whether it's 1,000 walled gardens or it's one big metaverse, this idea of a portable identity is going to be an important one. And so here's some snapshots from the early days of Ready Player Me, where they took a snapshot, a picture, and then they generated an avatar based on that. And of course, now both Cookie and Ready Player Me avatars have become part of the burgeoning fashion industry, the metaverse. In fact, I think Vogue is working with both Cookie as a virtual AI model and with Ready Player Me avatars within these different metaverse fashion events that are being held these days. It seems fairly regularly in the metaverse in 2022. Okay, in 2016, Microsoft released a chatbot called Tay.ai on Twitter, and they had to basically stop it because it was training itself on tweets, but ended up becoming racist and xenophobic. So Microsoft shut it down. And so this brings up, an often discussed issue around AI, which is what do you train the AI on, and how does that affect the behavior? The training data will affect the behavior of the chatbot. This was also the year, I believe, that Facebook had some AIs that it started to communicate with each other, and they were creating a language that could no longer be understood by humans in their communication. That was also shut down. And so, this touches on other aspects of AI and what should be allowed or shouldn't be allowed with AI. Okay, that's Tay.ai. Okay, we then jump to Little Michaela on Instagram. All right, let's jump to here. And so here you see Little Michaela is one of the first influencers that has really appeared in the last decade. Certainly one of the most popular. She had over 3 million followers on Instagram, and then she began to release pictures which look like she's outside. Now, this is interesting because, again, she looks like a computer-generated character like a Simone or one of these. Unlike Hatsune Miku, which had an anime-type avatar, she looks almost real. And she started to put out different videos. And of course, if you watch the videos, here, I'll let you watch a little clip from this online video that these guys put together talking about Little Michaela. So let's just watch that for a few minutes, and you can start to see the nature or the character of these virtual influencers who are not really AI because they're being either staged in terms of the pictures, or they're being acted with human voice actors and sometimes with motion capture. And many of the virtual character companies are a bit opaque about how exactly they're being generated, but there's no doubt that these virtual influencers are becoming bigger and bigger with millions of followers.
A couple of weeks ago, I found myself going down a YouTube hole, clicking from video to video, until I eventually found myself on the YouTube channel of Michaela.
Okay, so hi. This is fun and weird. Never done this before.
She's basically like if Emma Chamberlain
Thank you for watching my videos and being my friend.
became a Sims character.
Hi. Hi. I'm gonna share some of my life with you. Honestly, it could get kind of personal.
The interesting thing about her is that she's not a person. She's a character made by a team of writers and graphic artists here in Los Angeles.
I'm a 19-year-old musician, change seeker, taco truck expert, and robot.
We made a video about her over a year ago, and at that point, she had just been named one of Time Magazine's most influential people.
People feel really connected to her because it's written as if she were a real person.
She's grown a massive following on Instagram and has collaborated with major brands. And she has hit songs with millions of streams.
You say my name and it's like money, baby. I wanna spend it all on you.
Since our last video, she's partnered with Calvin Klein. She went to Coachella with YouTube Music.
What's up? It's Michaela here with YouTube Music at Coachella.
And recently became a member of Samsung's Team Galaxy to promote their new phones.
Posting on Instagram or Twitter is one thing, but seeing Michaela on YouTube is just bizarre.
I just want to feel close to someone who isn't my family.
YouTube just creates a deeper connection with the audience than Instagram.
Oh my god, you. I love you so much. More. Like, you're so awesome.
And in our opinion, it feels like a real friendship.
I don't think about it as me talking to this crowd of people. I always thought about it as me connecting with one person one-on-one.
Especially when the people you watch.
Right. So you can go to Samir and Colin's channel on YouTube to see the rest of it. But this really brings out, the interesting nature of virtual characters, which we're seeing more and more of. Now, later that year, in 2016, there was a new virtual character introduced called Kazuna AI in Japan, and she became known as the first or most popular VTuber, which stands for video YouTuber. And she had 3 million followers, not on Instagram, but on YouTube itself. And so she kept putting out these videos where she would do the same kinds of things, just like you saw with Michaela, but of course using this anime avatar. But she would answer questions on YouTube. In fact, we can see You can see one of the videos here.
今日はみんなから来たメッセージに答えます。声をもう少し低くした方がいいと思います。友達に勧めるとき必ず声がキンキンしててきついと言われます。アキネーターの時の声が一番聞きやすくて一般受けすると思います。よろしくお願いします。まずはメッセージありがとう。これちょっと
So she became a pretty big star in Japan, and even had live concerts, just like we saw with Hatsune Miku. And there was one in February of this year, 2022, after which she decided she was tired of being in public and went on a hiatus. Is currently, taking a break. In 2017, Replica AI is introduced. So this is another chatbot company, and they have an app on iOS and Android. And the idea is that you can meet your soulmate, or you can just meet an AI friend. Now, one thing that distinguishes it from Cookie is that you can have not just a friend, but a romantic relationship. So now we're coming full circle to the concept in the movie Her. But although users online basically said that if you choose that option, that just your replica will simply add words like my love at the end of sentences and conversations that you might have. There's been some controversy online about whether these AI are fully AI chatbot, or if they're humans backing them up in some way. But it's been quite successful. There are millions of users of the Replica consumer app. We'll see more and more of these types of AI friends over time. And speaking of Cookie and AI, we forward a couple of years, in 2020, there was an awkward first AI date between Cookie, who you see on the right in one of her avatars, and Blenderbot, who you see on the left, which was a chatbot that was created by Facebook. And they both are attached to avatars. There's a story in the BBC that was written about this awkward first date. Turns out Blenderbot, which was trained on lots of text by crawling the internet, knew about Cookie from from doing all that crawling. And anyway, it wasn't a very successful first date. But this first date between the male, quote unquote, and female AI was perhaps a portent of many things to come, moving beyond Her to AI love stories of all AI genders in the future, perhaps. Also in 2020, Roblox buys Loom.ai. Now, Loom was started as an avatar company that could let you use avatars in your Zoom meetings. So without the whole virtual world, you could basically communicate with other people through this virtual identity. By the way, this feature has now been, at least it's in alpha or beta from Zoom itself in 2022. But also they were trying to create avatars that look like you. So similar technology to using AI to have an avatar whose face looks like yours. And now Roblox is using that facial recognition technology, right? So that your Roblox avatar basically becomes like a mini Andy Serkis in Gollum, right? He can move his face and the avatar will basically mimic everything you do. There's similar technology within Meta at work as well. In 2021, Epic Games, the company behind Fortnite, released MetaHumans, and now you're starting to see avatars, virtual characters that look much more human, right? In fact, in many cases, using their different algorithms, the characters that they generate are almost indistinguishable. Now, when you animate them, again, it's still you can still tell. But I mentioned The Matrix Awakens, which had avatars of Neo and Trinity that looked extremely realistic, was built on top of this MetaHumans technology. The latest Cookie avatar, which you can see in my interview with her, also uses this technology. And so one of the creators within Epic talks about part of making such experiences in the metaverse is peopling that experience with characters, right? So we always think of the metaverse as a place where our avatars will hang out, but really the residents of the metaverse, the 24/7 residents, will be the NPCs, the characters, which Epic likes to call the metahumans. Now, also in 2021, in the fall, a new TV series, based upon all of the singing shows that have been on were released, such as The Voice. This one was called Alter Ego, and Alter Ego was a competition where you sang not as yourself, but as your avatar on stage. So here, let's look at a part of the promo for Alter Ego.
Magic.
Whoa.
This is unlike how we've seen people perform ever in the history of television.
This is freaking nutty nuts.
Fox is making television history and bringing you the world's first Avatar singing competition. This is Alter Ego.
Look what we got here.
Why do you feel like you need an alter ego?
There's something about how I look behind this alter ego that I feel like it's held me back.
Lost dreams and second chances are reignited when singers from all walks of life become the stars they've always dreamed of being.
Look what we got here. What?
Growing up, people always judged me by the way I looked and the way I sang, but I realized I don't have to be afraid.
In front of some of the biggest names in music, will.i.am, Alanis Morissette, Rhymes, and Nick Lachey, as they search for the next generation superstar.
I can't wait to meet the human beings behind these alter egos.
An alter ego actually really helps me a lot in life.
I like the hair. Yo, do that again, bro.
With cutting-edge technology never before used on television, singers' alter egos will be transported through the lens onto a real stage with real backup dancers and a live audience.
This alter ego is giving you just the invitation to step out and be even more of who you are.
Are those avatar tears?
Yeah, man, for real.
I think that's the beauty of this show is just you have no idea what's coming at you.
Also in 2021, in December, at the end of the year, Facebook finally released its Horizon Worlds. It came out of beta. It had been in beta for a couple of years. Here you're seeing a couple of images from Horizon Worlds. Here at the top, you see an image that shows, the avatars perhaps is how they're meant to be seen. And then you see down below it, the avatars without legs, which was one of the complaints about the early versions of Horizon Worlds. And one of the reasons Zuckerberg said they didn't have legs is, well, one, they're not totally relevant in movement, but two, they don't have a way to see what your legs are doing. Like we talked about with the facial capture, actually let you control your avatar in that way. But perhaps that's something, that will change. So that brings us pretty much to 2022, which is the year during which avatars have really been everywhere. We'll end with that for now, but basically, I could do a whole nother presentation just on 2022 and the happenings with different types of avatars, particularly in the fashion industry.